Hello, I'm Claire Jones and I'd like to welcome you to today's PRMA Consulting webinar about the Cancer Drugs Fund. Before we get started, here are some instructions for participating. If you have any technical problems, please type into the box on the dash panel, which may be on the right-hand side of your screen. We've already received a lot of questions from many of you. Thank you very much for those. But as additional questions occur to you, please type them into the question box as you see on the screen here, and we will respond by email in the next few days. The focus of this webinar is oncology. About 2/3 of PRMA Consulting's work is in oncology, including a wide range of solid and hematological malignancies. The webinar today is one of a series largely focused on oncology. You can see here some of the previous titles. Please let us know if you'd like access to recordings of any of these previous webinars. Now, the main reason we're here, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Antonia Morga, who is going to be responding to your questions about the CDF today. Antonia has first-hand experience of dealing with the new Cancer Drugs Fund. So without further ado, I'll start with the first question. Antonia, please could you start by explaining why the Cancer Drugs Fund was introduced, what were its main objectives, and then what were the reasons behind the need to reform it?
Certainly, and thank you, Claire. And may I also welcome all of the listeners into today's webinar. The government set up the Cancer Drug Fund in October 2010 as a way to improve access to cancer drugs that were not routinely available on the NHS. The choice was linked with the increasing awareness that the use of new cancer drugs in the UK was low compared to similar countries. The fund was initially expected to run until March 2014, while a long-term pricing mechanism was worked out. However, when initial plans on these mechanisms were no longer pursued, the fund was extended further until the end of March 2016. The fund aimed to provide access to cancer drugs that had not been appraised by NICE, that were still being appraised by the Institute, or that had been appraised and rejected by NICE on clinical or cost-effectiveness grounds. It's interesting to think that 51% of patients supported by the fund between April 2013 and March 2015 were using drugs that had received a negative NICE recommendation. Now, the fund certainly improved access to drugs not routinely available on the NHS. As this figure shows, the number of cancer patients in England approved for funding increased by approximately 30% each year between 2011-2012 and 2014-2015. From October 2010 to March 2015, more than 74,000 patients were approved to receive drugs through the fund. The fund was initially expected to run until March 2014, as we have already stated, with a total budget of £650 million. As this figure shows, between October 2010 and March 2013, the budget was underspent. But between 2013 and 2015, NHS England considerably overspent the allocated budget. The overspend was driven by an increase in the number of patients covered by the fund, as well as an increase in the average cost of treatment per patient. The lack of clear entry and exit criteria placed the fund under increasing substantial financial pressure. In March and September 2015, NHS England removed a number of drugs from the national list following a review of clinical effectiveness and cost. NHS England also secured discounts from some manufacturers. Yet, the predicted savings did not diminish the need to look at a fundamental and more comprehensive reform of the fund. Alongside the financial sustainability of the fund, there were also concerns on the impact of the resources spent in terms of patients' outcomes and to what extent this had been achieved. The Department of Health recognized the importance of outcome data collection when it set up the fund. However, hospital trusts were not mandated to submit data to the National Chemotherapy Dataset, not until April 2014. And even then, there were consistently significant gaps in the data submitted. Importantly, a study published earlier this year pointed out that the £280 million spent on the CDF in 2014-2015 added approximately 5,600 QALYs to patients' lives. But the same amount of resources would have added over £20,000 if used by the NHS on all illnesses. So Claire, to go back to your question, the need for reforming the CDF stemmed from certainly a need to control the financial expenditure on the fund, a need to assess the health outcomes generated for those patients funded through the CDF, and at the same time continue to guarantee access to potentially life-saving treatments. NHS England and NICE launched a full public consultation on proposals for reforming the CDF at the end of last year. In February this year, the NHS England board approved the plans and effectively established the CDF as a new managed access scheme with clearer entry and exit criteria. The new framework and operating model went live on the 29th of July 2016.
Thanks, Antonia. I think that provides an excellent summary of the need for reform and also suggests the thinking behind its redesign. Moving on from what's gone before to what's happening now, maybe you can tell us about the key features of the new CDF.
Absolutely. The changes introduced around the CDF rests on 4 pillars. First of all, a new redesigned role for NICE in the appraisal of cancer drugs. A focus on how the clinical uncertainty in the drug's evidence base, as identified during the course of the appraisal process, can be resolved through the collection of additional data. A clear remit around what drugs are actually eligible to be funded on the CDF, and a detailed mechanism establishing clear financial control and sustainability of the fund in the future.
That gives us a good framework for understanding the new fund, thank you. But a lot of people have been asking about NICE's role in the appraisal of cancer drugs and how that role has changed.
Indeed, it has changed quite substantially. As our audience can start to appreciate from this slide, under the new system, NICE will appraise all new cancer drugs or new indication of existing drugs, no matter how small the eligible patient population might be. The first appraisal meeting, in addition, is going to take place before CHMP opinion, and for this reason, the meeting will take place in private. The aim will be for NICE to produce guidance within 90 days from marketing authorization. When it comes to the end-of-life criteria, which many of our audience will know, allowed to increase the threshold for drugs from 30,000 per qualis to 50,000 per qualis, the small patient population will no longer be a requirement. And the appraisal committee has to be satisfied that the estimates around the extension to life achieved through the new treatment are sufficiently robust. But the most important change comes when we assess the content of the recommendation that the appraisal committee can issue. As in the past, the appraisal committee can recommend a drug for routine commissioning, may decide not to recommend a drug for routine commissioning, or it can recommend a drug for use within the CDF while additional data are collected, essentially funding with evidence generation. Now, the new recommendation will generally be made when the appraisal committee considers that there is the potential for the drug to meet the requirements for routine commissioning, but when significant clinical uncertainty remains, which is considered to be feasible to be addressed through an ad hoc data generation plan. Interestingly, a drug can be identified as a potential candidate for the CDF at 3 possible stages of the appraisal process. At submission stage by the manufacturers themselves, with proposals included alongside their dossier to NICE around the data collection plans. During the assessment stage by the evidence review group or by the NICE technical team, and following the first appraisal meeting by the appraisal committee itself. It's also important to see that an ad hoc working group has been planned, the so-called Data Collection Arrangement Working Group, which will effectively oversee the research questions and data collection proposal. The working group will solicit inputs from a range of additional sources, such as, for example, the NICE Observational Data Unit. I would like to draw the attention of our audience on the much broader remit of the NICE Appraisal Committee during the process, during the assessment of cancer drugs. The committee will define the nature, sources, and level of the clinical uncertainty and effectively the potential for the drug to be cost-effective. It will specify the research question as well as the number of patients that will have to be followed up and included in the evidence generation plan. When it is agreed that this additional evidence will be provided from ongoing clinical studies, the appraisal committee will consider whether the PICO questions for these studies can be generalized to the UK general population. And for new studies, if these are required, the NICE appraisal committee will consider if systemic anti-cancer chemotherapy dataset and databases available with Public Health England will provide data that will sufficiently address the clinical uncertainty.
So moving on to funding now, a lot of listeners have asked about not only the interim funding and what that consists of, but also the overall funding. What mechanism? I beg your pardon, I'm jumping ahead. I'll just go back to the question on the screen now. What processes have been put in place to address the uncertainty in the evidence base?
Absolutely, Claire, and we will certainly cover the point around overall funding for the CDF. The standard operating procedures document published in early July this year has identified in the managed access agreement signed between the pharmaceutical company and NHS England as the place where effectively how the clinical uncertainty and as well as the affordability of the drugs is going to be addressed. The managed access agreement consists of a CDF commercial agreement and a data collection agreement. Ideally, it should be in place close to the publication of the NICE recommendation, and it will cover the entire period that NICE considers to be relevant in order to collect this additional data. Focusing in particular on the CDF commercial agreement, this agreement, again signed between the manufacturer and NHS England, effectively determines the level of reimbursement for that drug during the managed access agreement. It's important to note that the entire eligible patient population, as determined by NICE, will be covered by the agreement. But more importantly, this agreement will be confidential, considered on a case-by-case basis, and sufficient to address the level of uncertainty identified by NICE. In other words, the manufacturer will be expected to make an offer to NHS England, whether a simple discount or a more complex scheme, that will be sufficient to lower the ISR within a plausible range that is considered to be cost-effective. When we look at the data collection agreement, it is possible to see that, again, the standard operating procedure has identified two main sources that the manufacturer, NICE and NHS England, can consider as suitable for providing the required data. If new analyses are deemed to be required, NHS England and NICE have identified into the systemic anti-cancer therapy database collection the preferred sources of such information. Why? Because this collection of data routinely already takes place in England, and the relevant infrastructures are already in place. But if NICE, alongside NHS England and the working group with input from the manufacturer, understands that there are relevant ongoing clinical studies that can potentially address this uncertainty, then they will certainly be willing to consider them. For example, it is possible that phase 2 or 3 trials, follow-ups on these trials might be happening, or phase 4 or pharmacovigilance studies might be put in place. I would like to stress that the data collection agreement will specify the time required for a meaningful collection of this data, and that the funding for any of such data collection will be provided by the company. However, the ownership of the data, especially when they come from the SACT database or other databases that sit with Public Health England, will remain with Public Health England. And it will be Public Health England will effectively run the analysis and then share them with NICE, NHS England and the company.
So now we're on to that important question about funding. Can you tell us what will now be funded by the CDF, and also touch on the interim funding, which is very interesting, and then what mechanisms will guarantee the financial sustainability of the CDF?
Indeed. The budget for the fund, whose fixed annual amount will be agreed by the NHS of England board, will be used to cover the cost of a range of drugs. First and foremost, those that we have seen will be captured under the managed access agreements, but also, as Claire has said, drugs receiving interim funding. We will soon see what this will consist of. Off-label drugs and indications, individual funding requests for cancer drugs received up to the end of July 2016, and existing CDF drugs or indications for whom there is a pending NICE appraisal or reconsideration. The fund will also cover the cost for its administration. I would like now to draw your attention on the interim funding process. In the past, the NHS used to fund drugs following the publication of the guidance by NICE after 90 days from the date when this publication had happened. But for those drugs that receive a recommendation from NICE for baseline commissioning or for funding on the CDF, funding will actually happen from the moment in which the drugs will receive marketing authorization. So effectively, there's the potential for patients to access these drugs at a much earlier stage. As for the off-label drugs and indications, this will be considered by NHS England, and the level of reimbursement will be driven by the rate of reimbursement currently in place for other indications for those drugs. Focusing our attention on the mechanisms that have been put in place in order to ensure the financial sustainability of the new CDF, it's important to note that the operation of the financial control mechanisms will be responsibility of the proposed Cancer Drug Fund Investment Group, a joint committee composed by NHS England and NICE representatives. Now, at the end of each financial year, pharmaceutical companies whose drugs have been funded either through managed access agreement or in the interim funding or off-label, or drugs have been transitioning through NICE, might be considered eligible for a rebate in the case in which the fund is considered to have overspent. The value of the rebate will be a pro rata calculated based on the spending on each company's drugs, as claimed by NHS trusts. Interestingly, the calculation of the rebate will be reviewed by an independent consultant appointed by NHS England, but the manufacturers will not be able to appeal against the rebate decisions, and effectively there will be no upper limit to the amount that NHS England and NICE, through the investment group, decide to recover.
So we've come to the final question. As we've seen, there are a number of risks associated with the new cancer drugs funds, not least that issue of rebates that we've just been discussing. But maybe, Antonia, you could just conclude by summarising what are the opportunities and challenges for manufacturers?
Yes, indeed. There are certainly some opportunities that are supported by this new system. Potentially, we can see this system as allowing access and reimbursement for those drugs where NICE in the past might have issued a straight negative recommendation. However, as we have seen, the access to the CDF is much more restrictive than in the past. There is equally a chance for rare diseases, which in the past might have not been considered by NICE on small population grounds. It's also positive that the NICE guidance will be published within a defined period following marketing authorization. And for the company itself, understanding the potential level and type of uncertainty that might affect their evidence base earlier on might actually be useful in order to put together and think about ad hoc studies. But there are certainly numerous challenges and equally risks. For example, if the CHMP opinion that the drug will receive differs substantially from the indication that the manufacturer had assumed in the submission, it's possible that new analysis might be required. In many instances, the list price for new drugs might not have been internally agreed by the manufacturer, nor externally confirmed by the Department of Health when the submission to NICE is due. There is no guarantee that the data collected following the managed access agreement period will address the uncertainty identified by NICE. And from a financial point of view, the impact of the commercial access agreement on the revenues generated by the drug can be substantial, and the cost of data collection through those ad hoc data sets is difficult to predict. There are then financial risks associated with the possibility of having to rebate CDF funds. So Claire, to summarize, and also for the benefit of our audience, we have seen that there was certainly a clear need to rethink the purpose and the nature of the Cancer Drug Fund. But whether the fundamental issues around guaranteeing access to potentially life-saving treatments, cancer treatments, innovative treatments, can be answered by this system is a question that will still wait an answer in the months and years to come.
Thank you very much, Antonia, and thank you to all of you who've attended today's webinar. In a couple of days' time, we'll be sending out a recording of the webinar so that you can also forward a link to colleagues who might not have been able to attend today. If you are left with unanswered questions, please do email us and we'll try to get back to you. Or we are also happy to set up a telephone conference to discuss any remaining questions. Thank you very much, and I hope to see you at the next webinar.